Elena Hall, a 27-year-old retail worker from Chattanooga, Tennessee, found herself embroiled in a passionate yet toxic affair with Tyler Collins, a 30-year-old construction worker. Elena believed their secret relationship would lead to a future together, but Tyler, who was already in a committed relationship, had other intentions. In 2020, the story of Elena Hall, a woman caught in the tangled web of a passionate affair, unraveled into a tale of rage, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. This is a story of obsession, deception, and a tragic moment where one person's heartbreak turned deadly. Before we dive into this case, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Let's get started. Elena Hall, a 27-year-old woman from Chattanooga, Tennessee, led what appeared to be a typical life. She worked a steady job at a local retail store, navigating through the ordinary day-to-day activities of her 20s. But beneath the surface, Elena harbored a secret that would later become a source of pain, obsession, and, ultimately, tragedy. Elena had always dreamed of love, of finding someone who would sweep her off her feet. And that's when Tyler Collins entered her life. Tyler, a 30-year-old construction worker, was charming, attractive, and engaging. He had his own life, a long-term girlfriend, a steady job, but for reasons unclear to everyone but himself, he began a secret affair with Elena. At first, the relationship seemed like a harmless fling, something neither of them expected to have any significant impact. But for Elena, it quickly evolved into something far deeper. She believed Tyler was someone special, someone who could provide the love and affection she'd been longing for. Despite the fact that Tyler was already committed to someone else, Elena found herself falling for him. The affair remained hidden, carefully concealed from the world, as they met in secret. Their rendezvous were often brief and intense, moments stolen away from the prying eyes of their lives outside of the relationship. To the outside world, Elena was just a regular woman, and Tyler was just a man in a committed relationship. But inside the walls of their secret trysts, things were far more complicated. For Elena, this relationship was more than just an affair. It was an escape from loneliness, an opportunity to live out a romantic fantasy. She envisioned a future with Tyler, believing that the bond they shared could somehow break through the walls of his existing relationship. But Tyler, on the other hand, seemed to see it as just a fling, an adventure, a distraction from his everyday life. He never intended for it to become anything serious. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the once secret affair between Elena Hall and Tyler Collins grew more tangled. What had begun as a brief, impulsive encounter was now a complicated web of deceit, lies, and unspoken emotions. Tyler, despite being in a committed relationship with his girlfriend, continued his affair with Elena. To him, the affair was a distraction, a temporary escape from the responsibilities and monotony of his everyday life. He would reassure Elena that he cared for her, but deep down, he had no intention of building a future with her. His long-term commitment to his girlfriend was his priority, and Elena was merely an outlet for his desire and frustration. To him, it was an affair in the shadows, nothing more. But for Elena, the affair was much more. She began to build a fantasy around their time together, believing that Tyler would eventually choose her over his girlfriend. She held on to the hope that their secret relationship could evolve into something real and lasting. Every stolen moment with Tyler, every whispered word of affection, was enough to keep her dreams alive. As the months went by, she grew more emotionally invested, blurring the lines between reality and the fantasy world she'd created in her mind. Tyler's actions, though, became more distant. While he would still meet her in private, there were fewer calls, less communication, and moments of coldness that Elena couldn't ignore. Tyler began to withdraw emotionally, no longer offering the reassurance that had once kept Elena clinging to the hope of a future together. He started spending more time with his girlfriend, attending events, and living the life that Elena so desperately wanted to be a part of. To Elena, this shift was a sign of betrayal. She couldn't understand why Tyler was pulling away, especially after all they had shared. But Tyler never saw it that way. He believed the affair had run its course and was now merely an extramarital fling, one that didn't need to disrupt his everyday life. He kept his girlfriend in the dark, lying about his whereabouts and what he was doing. Elena was becoming increasingly frustrated by Tyler's coldness, but she kept convincing herself that it was just a phase. Deep down, she knew something wasn't right, but she didn't want to face the reality that Tyler might be losing interest. In the meantime, Elena's emotional state began to deteriorate. Her infatuation with Tyler grew into obsession, and she became increasingly possessive. The lies she told herself to keep the affair alive started to bleed into her everyday interactions. She would confront Tyler about his behavior, but he would brush it off, telling her that everything was fine. Each time Tyler denied the growing distance between them, Elena felt more rejected, more isolated in a world she had created for the two of them. But this wasn't just about Tyler anymore. Elena's jealousy began to surface, and it wasn't just directed at his girlfriend. She found herself resenting the time Tyler spent away from her, resenting his ability to keep his life separate from her. The lies, the secretiveness, the constant emotional turmoil, it was too much for her to handle. Elena's mental state was spiraling, and she began to lash out. But Tyler's indifference only fueled her rage. The lies they both told had constructed a delicate illusion. Elena, clinging to the hope of a future with Tyler, refused to accept the reality of his disinterest. Tyler, living in his own world of deceit, ignored the fact that Elena's feelings were no longer just a casual attachment. As the distance between them grew, the tension escalated, and Elena's heartbreak turned into something darker. Elena, now consumed with a sense of betrayal, struggled to keep her emotions in check. She began to confront Tyler more aggressively, asking him why he was pulling away, accusing him of leading her on. Tyler, in turn, became more evasive, telling her that they needed to go their separate ways, but never giving a definitive answer. The emotional toll of the affair had become too great for both of them, and the lies began to unravel. It wasn't long before Elena realized that Tyler's feelings for her had faded. The web of lies they had both woven over the months was collapsing, and with it, Elena's hope for a future together. What was once a secret relationship built on passion and promise was now a source of pain, confusion, and betrayal. The lies had gone on long enough, and Elena could no longer ignore the truth. Tyler had moved on, and Elena was left with nothing but heartbreak and the intense emotions of a woman scorned. The tension that had been building for months, fueled by lies, jealousy, and heartbreak, finally reached its explosive climax. Elena Hall's world, already shattered by emotional turmoil, began to crumble as the true nature of her relationship with Tyler Collins became impossible to ignore. The web of lies that had bound them together began to unravel, revealing the deep, painful truth. By now, Elena had come to the painful realization that Tyler had no intention of leaving his girlfriend. The fantasy she had clung to, the dream of a future with him, was nothing but an illusion. The affair, which had once been full of promise, had devolved into a string of broken promises and emotional neglect. Tyler, despite his occasional gestures of affection, had emotionally checked out long ago. For him, it had been a temporary escape, not the start of a new life. Elena's anger began to crow, consuming her thoughts and clouding her judgment. She couldn't understand why Tyler would keep stringing her along, promising her the world while staying firmly rooted in his relationship with his girlfriend. The more she reflected on their time together, the more she felt used, betrayed by a man who had never truly loved her. Tyler's words, once comforting, now felt empty, his actions no longer aligning with his promises. At the same time, Elena began to feel a deep sense of humiliation. She had been living in a world of lies, convincing herself that Tyler would eventually choose her over his girlfriend. The reality, however, was much darker. She was not the center of his life, but merely an affair, a fleeting distraction. The thought of this left her feeling worthless, as if her love had meant nothing. This sense of rejection began to overwhelm her, intensifying the feelings of rage and betrayal that had been building inside her for months. One evening, in a particularly heated conversation with Tyler, Elena confronted him about his growing distance and lack of commitment. She demanded to know why he was treating her this way after everything they had shared. Tyler, cold and uninterested, offered no meaningful response. He simply told her that he couldn't continue the affair, that it was over. Elena, devastated by the finality of his words, felt as if her entire world had just come crashing down. For Elena, this moment was the final straw. The emotional toll of their secret relationship, the endless lies, and the crushing sense of betrayal ignited something inside her, a dangerous and uncontrollable fury. She had spent months trying to hold on to a relationship that was always doomed, and now, in one conversation, it was gone. Tyler had left her with nothing but the remnants of a love that had never truly existed. In the aftermath of the conversation, Elena's thoughts became consumed by a singular, overwhelming urge. She wanted revenge. Tyler had taken everything from her: her time, her energy, her love, and in return, he had given her nothing but pain. She could not let him walk away from her without consequences. The lies had to be exposed, and Tyler had to face the emotional devastation he had caused. The moment of clarity that Elena experienced was not one of understanding or healing, it was a moment of fury. The realization that she had been betrayed by the man she had once thought of as her soulmate ignited something inside her that was both reckless and dangerous. In her mind, Tyler had robbed her of her dignity, and now he had to pay the price. Driven by this newfound anger and the crushing weight of rejection, Elena formulated a plan. She didn't want closure or answers, she wanted justice, and she was determined to make Tyler understand the depth of her pain. Her mind became consumed with the idea of making Tyler feel the same heartache she had endured for so long. But the darker truth was that Elena had lost control. Her emotions, which had been festering for months, had finally taken over, and in her pain, she sought out a form of punishment that was irreversible. The revelation that Tyler had no intention of being with her was too much to bear. She couldn't accept the truth. She couldn't accept the fact that she had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life. Elena's mind was clouded with rage, and she became fixated on a singular thought: Tyler had to suffer. The man who had deceived her, manipulated her emotions, and left her heartbroken, he needed to feel the same anguish she felt. The lines between right and wrong blurred completely, and in that moment of emotional collapse, Elena's actions were driven by an overwhelming need to punish. As the days wore on, Elena Hall's obsession with Tyler Collins deepened. She could no longer escape the emotional turmoil that consumed her. The reality of her situation, the destruction of a relationship she had once believed would be her salvation, was unbearable. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and, above all, angry. Anger had become her constant companion, and with it came a dark sense of entitlement. She was determined to make Tyler understand the depth of her pain, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. What had once been a relationship built on desire and hope had now morphed into an all-consuming rage. The night of the confrontation arrived. Elena, determined to force a final resolution, reached out to Tyler one last time. She knew this would be their last meeting, and she was prepared for it. In her mind, she was no longer interested in reconciliation or closure. She was seeking retribution. She wanted Tyler to feel the weight of the emotional devastation he had caused her, and she was prepared to make him understand the consequences of his actions. When Tyler arrived at the meeting place, a secluded area that had once held special meaning for them, he was unaware of the storm brewing in Elena's heart. He had no idea that this meeting would not be like the others, the ones filled with tentative words, apologies, and false promises. This time, Elena was different. She was no longer the woman who had loved him with everything she had. She was a woman scorned, and her fury would not be appeased. Their conversation began as many others had. Elena confronted him, accusing him of leading her on, of making her believe that he would eventually choose her over his girlfriend. Tyler, seemingly detached from the emotional weight of the situation, attempted to defend himself, explaining that he had been confused and wasn't ready to make a commitment. But his words did little to calm Elena's growing anger. She had heard these excuses before, and she was done listening. She demanded an explanation, something more than the empty words he had offered her in the past. The frustration in Elena's voice grew louder, her anger becoming more palpable. She accused Tyler of being a coward, of taking advantage of her, of using her as a placeholder until something better came along. As she spoke, her emotions surged uncontrollably. What had started as a confrontation quickly escalated into an explosive argument, each word fueling the fire that had been burning within her for months. Her mind, clouded by rage, was no longer focused on finding resolution. All she could think about was making Tyler understand how deeply he had hurt her. Tyler, caught off guard by the intensity of her anger, tried to calm her down. But his attempts only seemed to inflame the situation. He told her he had never intended to hurt her, that he cared about her, but the damage had already been done. Elena could no longer hear his words. All she could hear was the pain, the rejection, and the humiliation. The idea that he was now dismissing her feelings, trying to minimize the hurt he had caused, was too much to bear. In that moment, something inside Elena snapped. The years of emotional abuse, the lies, and the broken promises overwhelmed her, and her rationality disappeared. She grabbed for something, anything that could give her a sense of control. Her mind raced as she searched for a way to make Tyler feel the agony she had been living with. And then, in a moment of desperation, her hand found it. Elena pulled a weapon, something she had brought with her in the heat of the moment, an instrument that had never been part of her plan, but now felt like her only way to reclaim control over the situation. The weapon, in her hands, symbolized the fury that had been building inside her for so long. Her rage was no longer something she could suppress, it was all-consuming. In a sudden, unpredictable act of violence, Elena attacked Tyler. He was taken by surprise, unable to defend himself from the onslaught of her fury. The argument, which had once been about love and betrayal, had now turned into something far darker, a violent clash between two people who had once been intimate, but now only represented each other's worst fears and deepest wounds. Tyler tried to fight back, but it was too late. Elena, in her rage and emotional chaos, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The confrontation escalated far beyond anything either of them could have anticipated. In a matter of moments, the man she had once loved was left gravely wounded, his life hanging in the balance. As the violence subsided, Elena stood over him, breathing heavily, the reality of what she had just done sinking in. Her emotions were a storm: shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of finality. She had gone too far. What had begun as a quest for revenge, a desire to make Tyler understand her pain, had now turned into a tragedy. She had made a choice that could never be undone. In the immediate aftermath, Elena fled the scene, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of what had just occurred, but she was too lost in her emotions to fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. She had done what she thought was necessary, but now there was no turning back. Tyler, left bleeding and in agony, was soon discovered by a passerby who called for help. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Tyler Collins, a man whose actions had caused so much pain and turmoil, was pronounced dead. Elena's life, once filled with love and hope, had now been irreversibly altered. What had begun as an affair full of promise had ended in a tragedy of violence and loss. She was no longer the woman who had loved Tyler with everything she had. She was now the woman who had taken his life, her rage leading to an irreversible act. In the days following the brutal confrontation, Elena Hall was consumed with a combination of disbelief, shock, and a sense of crushing guilt. The gravity of her actions had begun to settle in, but it was still too surreal for her to fully process. Tyler Collins, a man who had once been a lover, a confidant, and someone she had once placed her trust in, was now dead. Elena was left to grapple with the devastating consequences of a moment of fury that she could never undo. Her initial escape from the crime scene, fueled by adrenaline and fear, gave way to the cold, paralyzing realization that she had just killed the man who had been the center of her emotional world. In her heart, Elena knew that there was no going back from this. No amount of regret or sorrow would ever bring Tyler back. But in those early moments, Elena couldn't even bring herself to face the full consequences of her actions. She knew that the police would eventually come for her. There was no hiding from the truth of what had happened. However, the weight of this impending reality only seemed to intensify her internal turmoil. As Tyler lay dying in that secluded area, the world around them was unaware of the tragedy unfolding. It wasn't until a passerby stumbled upon the scene, hearing Tyler's cries for help, that the emergency services were alerted. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Tyler's wounds were too severe. He succumbed to his injuries before reaching the hospital. The medical team's attempts to save him were futile, and the news soon spread that Tyler Collins, a young man whose life had been filled with contradictions, was gone. The police were called to the scene shortly thereafter, and they quickly began piecing together the evidence. A forensic investigation would reveal the extent of the violence, but the truth of what had transpired was already clear. This was not a random act of violence. This was the tragic culmination of months of emotional manipulation, betrayal, and deep personal turmoil. Elena, hiding out at a friend's house, didn't realize how quickly the authorities would catch up with her. The investigation into Tyler's death moved swiftly, and it wasn't long before Elena was identified as the prime suspect. The police, having already uncovered evidence of her prior emotional and intimate connection with Tyler, began to piece together the story of their toxic relationship. Elena had been in contact with Tyler right up until the moment of the confrontation. Her phone records, the texts, the social media messages, they all told a story of a woman deeply enmeshed in a relationship that had now turned fatal. And while Elena may have hoped to escape the consequences of her actions, the evidence mounted against her. The police traced her movements and soon found her hiding in a friend's house, where she had been seeking refuge from the storm she had created. The arrest of Elena Hall was a stark moment. What had once been a young woman trying to build a life of love and excitement had now become a person facing the harsh reality of the law. The police, with the evidence they had gathered, took Elena into custody without resistance. She did not put up a fight. Her guilt, her internal turmoil, was evident. She knew what she had done, and the weight of her actions was now fully upon her shoulders. As Elena was led away in handcuffs, the world outside began to process the shocking nature of the crime. The news spread, and the public reaction was swift. Elena, once the object of Tyler's affection, had become a cold-blooded murderer in their eyes. Many people, shocked by the suddenness of the violence and the brutality of the act, couldn't comprehend how the passionate affair could have spiraled into such a deadly end. Tyler's family and friends were devastated by the loss. They struggled to come to terms with the fact that someone who had been a part of their lives was now gone, taken away so suddenly, so violently. The grief was overwhelming, but there was also confusion and anger. How could someone with whom Tyler had shared a personal connection, someone who had been so close to him, have taken his life? Tyler's loved ones were left with the unspeakable pain of losing him, but they were also left to try to understand the events leading up to that night. Elena, on the other hand, had to face a different kind of grief. She was not only dealing with the trauma of having killed someone, but she was also facing the reality of her own actions. Her feelings of guilt and remorse were overwhelming, but they were also overshadowed by the cold, hard truth that she had just destroyed 2 lives, Tyler's and her own. The consequences of her actions would forever alter the course of her life. In the aftermath, the trial began. Elena's defense attorney, understanding the severity of the case, sought to paint a picture of a woman who had been deeply emotionally affected, a woman pushed to her breaking point by the betrayal and manipulation of a man she had loved. They argued that Elena was overwhelmed by her emotions, that she had acted out of a sense of deep hurt, and that the killing was not premeditated but rather an act of impulsive rage. Prosecutors, on the other hand, argued that while Elena may have been emotionally distraught, the level of violence she had unleashed on Tyler could not be justified. They painted her as a woman who had taken matters into her own hands, taking the life of a person who had wronged her in the most final way possible. The courtroom drama played out as the defense and prosecution made their cases. Throughout the proceedings, Elena sat silently, her face often hidden in her hands as she wept. Her emotions were raw, her regret almost palpable, but the reality of the crime she had committed was undeniable. Her life would never be the same again, no matter the outcome of the trial. Eventually, Elena was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge, while acknowledging the emotional factors that had contributed to the crime, could not overlook the violence and finality of the act. Elena was sentenced to a significant prison term, a sentence that would ensure she spent many years reflecting on the devastating consequences of her actions. For Elena, the prison sentence marked the end of the life she had once known and the beginning of a new reality. A reality where her rage and her inability to control her emotions had led to the irrevocable loss of a life. After the deadly confrontation between Elena Hall and Tyler Collins, the legal system was called upon to determine Elena's fate. The police quickly began to gather evidence, which included Tyler's body and forensic details pointing to Elena as the perpetrator. Witness statements and phone records also revealed the escalating tension in their relationship leading up to the fatal event. Once arrested, Elena's defense team argued that she acted in a fit of rage, spurred on by the discovery of Tyler's secret relationship. They emphasized her emotional distress, hoping for a reduced sentence by portraying the crime as a momentary lapse in judgment. However, the prosecution presented a different narrative. They highlighted the brutal nature of the crime, pointing to the multiple stab wounds as evidence of a deliberate act of violence rather than a spontaneous outburst. The prosecution argued that Elena had time to control her actions but chose not to. During the trial, Elena took the stand, expressing remorse and explaining the heartbreak she felt from Tyler's betrayal. Though her testimony was emotional, it did not change the fact that she had taken a life. The defense failed to convince the jury that her actions were anything but intentional. After deliberation, the jury found Elena guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to a lengthy prison term, acknowledging the emotional turmoil behind her actions, but stressing the need for justice. Elena's sentence was a consequence of her inability to control her emotions, leading to the tragic death of Tyler Collins. Though Elena's legal journey provided some closure, it did not erase the pain for Tyler's family, who would never recover from the loss. Elena's sentence served as a stark reminder that no matter the emotional triggers, taking a life is a crime with severe consequences. The Elena Hall case remains a haunting reminder of how love, betrayal, and unchecked emotions can lead to devastating consequences. It's a story of how a secret affair, once full of promise, can morph into something dangerous when the boundaries of affection and obsession are blurred. Elena's tragic actions left Tyler's family grieving a senseless loss. His loved ones struggled to comprehend how a simple affair, fueled by lies and emotional manipulation, could end in such horror. Meanwhile, Elena, imprisoned for her crime, must come to terms with the consequences of her actions. The life she took, the future she destroyed, and the irreversible damage done by one night of rage. This case raises critical questions about relationships built on lies, about the complexity of emotions, and about the cost of betrayal. It's a story of love and loss, but ultimately, of a fatal mistake made in the heat of emotional pain. What do you think about Elena Hall's case? Share your thoughts in the comments below.